was a really, really good sleeper when he was a little baby, but that meant that he really wanted to sleep in exactly the same position all the time. So he ended up with a little flat spot on his head. I didn't notice it until it was to the point that he needed a helmet. Our pediatrician sent us. So we wanted to get it corrected before he got too old. His flat spot was not just a little flat spot. He had the whole back right side of his head seemed flat, and it was to the point where his ears were uneven and you could start to see it in his face. They had told us that his head was to the point where glasses probably wouldn't fit him and that he may end up having some sinus problems if it wasn't corrected. It was actually really great working here with them. When we first brought him in, he wasn't holding his head up by himself yet, so it was really hard to get measurements on a wobbly baby, and it was hard to even tell, I guess, how bad his head was because he wouldn't hold his head up by himself. So I was a little worried about somebody handling him when his head, was kind of flopping around, but they had dealt with that before. They knew what to do, and they were really great with him. He was diagnosed around 3 months when I noticed that his head felt a little different on one side. He was only in his helmet for about 2 months. He was a pretty fast-growing baby, and he was really young at the time, so he had a really good success with it. He did fine. He didn't like the action of actually putting it on him, just because what baby likes to be held still while you put a helmet on their head. But once it was on, he didn't seem to notice it was there, and he didn't care. He didn't seem uncomfortable at all. They were really great. They were very accommodating with my new mom, calling them at all hours, paranoid questions, and sending them emails. We had a couple times where I thought there was a problem with the padding, or I thought he was, getting a little red spot from the helmet, like little adjustments that needed to be made, and they were always really great about getting us in when we needed to get in and taking a look at him, and they seemed to put up with my new mom paranoia very well. I appreciated that. We were a little bit worried about how they were going to measure his head for the helmet. But it turned out that what they did was they put this white sock over his head, so just his face was sticking out, and put these little reflective dots all over his head and his face. And then they basically scanned him with this big, almost like a supermarket barcode scanner. It's just scanned his entire head, and a model of his head showed up on a computer monitor. He loves the flashing lights. He didn't mind the sock. He didn't mind the little dots. He thought the whole thing was incredibly entertaining. And it was extremely painless. We visited another company the same day that we came to visit here for the first time. The other company seemed kind of more like a high-volume operation, and we were a little less comfortable with that. Also, we're both engineers, and we understand the technology, involved in the helmet, and we're not experts in it, obviously, but to us, this technology made a little more sense and seemed a bit more robust than the other one. The other helmet was more flexible. It wasn't nearly as stiff as the helmet here, and you could also adjust how big the gap was when you closed the helmet. It was secured with a Velcro strap. And I was worried as a parent that if I over-tightened it or under-tightened it, we would have just spent a lot of money and a lot of time and not, gotten the correction on his head. This one had little stoppers on the side, so you couldn't screw it up. Like it was, no matter what you did as a parent, it was going to be adjusted the right way, and that made us a little more comfortable that we didn't have any control over the helmet, that the experts were completely in control. One of the things I was worried about before we got it was that people were going to kind of point and stare and think he was, I don't know. But for the most part, I was pretty surprised. Everyone seemed to know what the helmet was and knew a lot of other babies that had it, and no one really pointed and stared. It wasn't a big deal. Can't tell he ever had a problem with his head. His head looks perfect, and honestly, any trauma we felt at the time with the helmet, we've long forgotten. It just was such a short time in his life that it didn't really impact us in any kind of negative way. It was great, so.